Hello everybody and welcome back to the Road to NM series. We're starting off with part 3 here today, and we're going to be looking at a tournament from this previous weekend play down in Orlando, Florida, and that was the Southern Open. I had the opportunity to play in the top section, the open section, where there was a lot of very strong competition, and got in 3 games against some very strong opponents, which I'm going to share the highlights and lowlights with you here today. So let's go ahead and dive into the first round action. In the first round, I got to play the black pieces, taking on National Master Todd Charles Bryant, whose rating is over 2,200, as you can see. That's our goal. Our goal is to reach NM one day ourselves, so getting to play Todd got to get a little bit of taste of what do I need to do to get there, right? How can I reach that level? How can I reach that National Master status? So let's go ahead and take a look at the position and see what is going on. In the position, we have reached a queenless middle game out of a French defense. And there's a few things that are happening here that we'll look at before we get into the moves too much. There are some things which black has achieved, which are very nice. As the black pieces, black has managed to play this move bishop to a6 and get his pawns on the a5 and b4 squares. And what this is allowing black to do is he's looking to trade off this bishop, which is traditionally a very bad bishop in the French defense. Usually it's stuck here on c8 behind all of the light squared pawns. So black has managed to give this bishop a little bit of space and is looking to trade it off. Also, black has a little bit of space on the queen side, but white is ready to chip away at this ideas of pushing any of these pawns, and you'll notice that white, his king is a little bit more centralized further up the board than black's, and both of his rooks have already come to the queen side, so white is a little bit ahead in development, basically by a move, because black could always bring his rook into the other side. White has more space on the king side, black has more space on the queen side, and it seems like maybe we've got this sort of dynamic equality going on. Black is hoping to maintain that equality and show that white really hasn't achieved anything out of this opening. At this moment in time, I was very comfortable with this position as black. I felt that I had achieved my aims by getting this bishop out, as we mentioned before. However, white found a very nice move here that puts some real practical challenges to black, and we're going to see over the course of the rest of this game that even though black is probably equal throughout this time, white really has all the practical chances. White ends up being the one who can constantly push a little bit more in this queenless middle game, this end game that we have fighting the whole time. And it all starts with this move right here, because if black gets another move, if it were black to play, well, I could bring my rook to c8, help to protect this knight a little bit, put pressure on the c-file, and we would have a completely equal game. There's no doubt about it. Black can look to trade off the bishops and continue from there. It's going to be very, very difficult for white to achieve any sort of breakthrough. However, white is able to jump on the situation right away, and how does he do that? Well, as we mentioned before, white is slightly more developed here, and this knight here on c5 is a little bit airy. It's true that it's attacking the bishop on d3, but if this c-pawn comes off the board, then the rook is going to be looking at the knight. The knight is going to be hanging. Now, also important to know is that even though black has achieved bringing his bishop to a6, a lot of times in these positions, black does not want to trade the knight for the bishop. He wants to trade the bishop for the bishop. The reason being is that this bishop, even though it's gotten out of this structure, it's come to a6, where is it going to go after this? If we lose the knight and play this endgame of knight versus bishop, the black bishop will not have good squares to go to. It's going to have to try to come all the way to f1 to get out of the structure because the king is controlling everything. The rook controls that right now. So the bishop still would be bad in the case of trading off our knight for white's light squared bishop. So that's why we don't really want to play this move, even though it might look like, yeah, we can take this bishop on d3. We really don't want to do that with our knight because we're going to get the dreaded French endgame, one that most French players are aware of and want to avoid, of bad bishop versus good knight, and that would just not be any fun at all. So here white plays the move a3. And what is the purpose of this move? Well, the point is very simple. As we said, white has already brought both of their rooks to the queen side, and what Todd's looking to do here is pry open this A file, put pressure on the B4 square, and then simply activate his rooks, be able to get more pressure along this file, and try to infiltrate in that way if he can, use his kingside space advantage, and keep pressing in the position. Now, the problem that this poses for black is black would prefer not really to allow white to open up this A file and get this nice rook if he can help it, but there aren't a lot of good ways to stop this. One idea, of course, is this nice little move B3, right? This looks like maybe we're going to be able to create something here because, well, if white makes the mistake of taking with the pawn, this would be a big blunder because now suddenly the pawn is not defending the bishop, and black can play knight takes d3, winning the bishop. Very nice looking. The problem is that white does not have to take with the pawn. He can take with the knight instead. And even though it still looks like maybe there's some airy things up in the air, the problem is the c5 knight is not defended. So if we try an idea like bishop takes bishop, where now if the pawn takes, we take the knight and fork the rooks, that looks great. Well, the problem is he doesn't have to take our bishop right away. He can interpose with knight takes c5. That's check, and after the king moves, now he can take the bishop and be up a full piece, so we can't go about this line. b3 is not going to be sound because of knight takes. So bishop takes wouldn't work, and if we play the move knight takes b3, this would be our other try here. Well, white can choose between, well, basically he just takes back our knight. And now we can trade the bishops, but after bishop takes, king takes, it's white who is now up a pawn and has a 3-1 majority over here. It's true we have this protected pass d-pawn, and so maybe we can argue that this still gives us equality because of white's doubled pawns on the b file, but we have chosen to basically go into a rook and pawn endgame down the full pawn, and we're still a little bit behind. We're going to have to bring our other rook over. White is going to be able to place this king on d4 and very effectively blockade this protected pass pawn on d5. So even though it looks pretty as a protected passer, white's going to create a passer of their own very quickly and have the outside passed pawn. So if the rooks come off the board in the king and pawn endgames, that outside passed pawn can be very critical more often than not. So we definitely don't want to enter this line. This is going to be a real struggle to have to defend. So a3 is played. b3 originally was the first idea I had earlier in the position to prevent this. White's king had recently come to e3, and b3 was working better before white's king came to e3 because it gives more control over that d3 bishop, but now white can play this move. And so b3 is not an idea we can use. This really means we've got a couple other options. Well, of course, we can take the bishop with either one of our pieces. As we mentioned before, if we play bishop takes bishop, well, after c takes bishop, now the rook is aiming down this file and our knight is under attack. And this makes things a little bit difficult to deal with. We're going to have to play a move to bring our rook over, play the move rook h to c8. And now after a takes b5, our pawn is going to be pinned. And why is that? Well, if we play a takes b4, now rook takes a8, and this rook is overloaded. We cannot defend the knight and capture the rook on a8, and we would be losing a full piece here after rook takes a8, rook takes knight, and we are completely losing. So we can't trade bishops and allow the rook to open up onto our knight. Of course, we can't defend the knight in that line. We would have to move it. So really the only things we could consider would maybe be we could try a move like knight to a4. Though this looks pretty dodgy, white can play a move, maybe just rook c2. Maybe he'll try to infiltrate with the rook at some point. This looks like a off square for the knight, even though it puts some pressure on this b2 square. This is going to be a little bit awkward, and where's the knight going to go after this? So after something like rook c2, these squares are all covered. Only place we can really bring the knight back to is b6, and the c4 square is covered from there, so where does it go from there? Not good routes for the knight, not a lot of pleasant squares for our pieces to go to. So bishop takes bishop, as much as that's part of our plan, as much as we want to try to trade off those light squared bishops, doing it immediately isn't really going to give us anything. It's going to give white some more sort of pressure, the ability to keep pressing in this position, as we mentioned. Knight takes d3, we mentioned before. Well, of course, after c takes d3, white simply gains control of the c file. In addition to still being ready to open up the a file, he's going to have two very nice rooks, and we also have now this bad bishop versus good knight scenario. So we definitely don't want to do this. It's going to be bad positionally for us. So really, this is leaving us very minimal options. We don't want to take with the bishop. We don't want to take with the knight. We don't want to play b3. This leaves kind of two more ideas. One is to play b takes a3, and the other would be simply to ignore this threat and develop our rook to either c8 or b8. So how should we choose from here? Well, if we play b takes a3, this sort of plays into white's plans. White, of course, gets the option here of either taking with the b pawn or the rook. Rook takes appears to be more natural to me, keeping pressure down this file. And now also this a5 pawn is under attack. So if we did play the move bishop takes in order to try to defend our pawn, then once again after pawn takes, the rook is opening up the attack onto this knight, and we can come over and try to defend our knight this way. But once again, white just has these nice open lines. We're tied down to the defense of our pieces. If I ever move the knight, he can play rook takes rook, and if I recapture, the pawn will fall. So I would have to take with the king, and white is just going to have more space here. This is much more pleasant looking. White can even maybe dream of playing here b4, right? Because remember, this a5 pawn is pinned, so if we take the pawn, rook takes rook, and once again, our rook will be overloaded. If the knight moves, then we're basically going to have to look at something like knight b7, trying to hold this pawn. And again, after rook takes rook, we have to play king takes rook. And now white can maybe play b4. Has a very nice protected passed pawn here. Can look to continue to gain space with that. Or we could even consider capturing over here. There's lots of different ways for white to continue to add pressure in this position, maybe even knight to c6 or knight to b3. There's nothing very nice happening here for the black pieces. So we don't like b takes a3. All of these moves, everything is just not looking great. This leaves two more ideas, and that is basically to develop the rook and wait for white. And the question now is, do we put the rook on c8 or b8? c8 appears to be the more natural move because rook to c8 defends this knight, which is critical in so many of those lines that we just looked at before. However, the rook on c8 loses a little bit of control of another square where this knight potentially wants to go, and that's going to be the b5 square. And let's see how white can take advantage of that. So after white would play the move a takes b5, a takes b5, well, now, of course, white has all this pressure building against our bishop here. So what white can do is play bishop takes bishop, and black has to choose between a capture with either the rook or the knight. If the rook takes, it looks like maybe we're trading some stuff off, moving toward a nice-looking endgame. But after the move rook to a1, white puts immediate pressure on this knight, and black is going to be in a little bit of trouble. He can't play rook to c6 to defend. If he plays rook a8, then it's going to be very passive, and this knight is going to be tied down. Only the c7 square, where it will have to recapture on a8 if anything should happen. And so if we play knight to c5, which looks natural, then even though white could maybe play rook a7 check, we would play rook c7 here right away, so that doesn't work very well. But now white has that annoying move we mentioned, knight to b5, and even though this is sort of diving into the position, perhaps it looks like it's premature, there's a real threat now of playing rook a7, and rook a7 would skewer all of these pieces here along the back rank, causing a lot of havoc in the black position. If black plays rook to b8, attacking the knight and preparing to block by bringing the rook to b7. Then again, after rook to a7 here, if we play the move rook to b7 is what we are talking about in this sort of position, it's still not so very comfortable for the black pieces. He can trade, bring his king to d4. That's one idea. Also, this pawn is very loose over here on the b4 square. So white could even, rather than checking, maybe just play a move like rook to a5. And how is black going to unwind in this position? It's not entirely clear. White is continuing to improve his pieces. A move like king to c6 simply is going to revolve back into this check, and white can continue to come into the position. There's a lot of threats here. White maybe wants to bring the rook into b5. The problem for black is that this b4 pawn is loose. It's not going to be well supported. White is infiltrating, and even though it may not be there an immediate breakthrough here, black is totally on the back foot, and really no matter what here, black is going to find themselves on the back foot in all of these positions. And let's go ahead and go back. After looking at all of these different lines, I decided to go with the move rook to b8. And the point here is that we're helping to protect this pawn. Maybe I'll dream now of opening things up here if white does not take. I can maybe even now dream of pushing b3 because it's going to add more protection to that square. And the rook is also eyeing that b5 square, preventing that knight to jump in some of those later lines. However, what happens here, let's go ahead and take a look. We get a few more moves. A takes, bishop takes, and now black has to make a decision whether to take with the rook or take with the knight. If black takes with the rook, it gets very similar to that line we looked at before, where now white is going to get this A file, get a lot of pressure down this file, and it's not going to be so clear for black how to go about his business. Again, we can play knight c5 with the idea that if the rook comes to a7, we can play rook b7. But then a move like rook to a5 looks a little troublesome. So after something like this and rook a5, where does this knight go? It's suddenly under attack, and it's actually trapped. It has no retreat squares. It can't go anywhere. And if we play rook c8, now rook b5 will pick up the pawn, and this is going to be bad. So this was something that I was worried about after rook takes, because that knight is running out of squares, so we're almost forced to play a move like knight c7, which just looks pretty ugly after something like rook to a7, pinning this knight, tying my pieces down on the back rank, and making it very hard for black to unwind. White is going to have all the play in the game. So instead of taking with the rook and allowing the trade, I decided to take immediately with the knight. And the point now is that I still have some control over the A file, and I can play a move like knight to c7 and try to get both rooks off of the board. However, in return for that, we're going to have a very, very passive knight. So white plays knight, or rook rather, to a5, preparing to double those rooks and take control of the A file. Knight c7 contests it right away. Rook c to a1, and now we are going to see a trade-off of pieces, trying to relieve some of that pressure on the black's position. Rook takes a5, rook takes a5, and rook to a8. And once again here, the two real options for black are either rook a8 or rook b6, with the idea of bringing the rook to a6 to try to, again, lessen the pressure on the position. But the problem is, even though rook b6 looks like the more natural move, trying to help that knight to develop forward rather than capturing on a8, white can simply drop his rook back a square, rook to a4, and rook a6 is no longer going to be any good because the b4 pawn will hang. And yes, as black, we could maybe play knight to a6 here, but again, this knight is going to be stuck passively. Our king is not going to be able to come forward into the game because white's knight is a monster. And we can't really even bring our knight to that c5 square effectively, because then we end up in that same position we already looked at earlier, where there's ideas of rook a7 check and the rook falls back, and then the rook comes to a5 and traps the knight. So all sorts of issues still in the position for black. It was constantly having to find these only moves in order to try to hold and defend the position, but it's still not so comfortable. So rook to a8. The rooks trade off, and now we enter this endgame, and okay, material is equal, Black still has some fighting chances because white doesn't have a way to immediately take advantage of things, but undoubtedly I think we can all assess that white has a better endgame going on. And why is that? How can we make that objective assessment? Well, the knight on a8 is not the happy square for the knight. That's already out of the game. Everybody sees that. That much is obvious, so that's one negative for black. Second negative, the pawn on b4. This is a weakness. It's isolated. It's out there all by itself, and we're not going to have a great way to help defend this pawn unless we maybe bring our king to our king side or use our knight, and either one of these is going to tie one of our pieces down to defending this. So that's one weakness that we have to keep an eye on. Thirdly, our king side has done nothing to expand, and white has more space. There's ideas of things like g4, h4, f5, all in the position. So white has a spatial advantage on the king side. These are three key reasons why black needs to be very careful in this endgame and is slightly worse, close to potentially losing, though not busted yet. Some things that black does have going for them, of course, this d5 pawn is protected. The structure is very solid. It's hard for white to achieve a breakthrough here. And the material is equal. Black does have a centralized king, some flexibility of where it's going to go, and he wants to bring his knight back into the game, maybe even try to get it to some of these squares, target some of white's weaknesses on the queen side. So it's not the end of the world, but white certainly has the advantage. We're going to play through a few moves here fairly quickly without looking at everything super in depth in order to see where white achieves the real breakthrough here. Of course, white is trying to create more targets, reroutes his knight, looking to come to g5 to attack h7 and f7. h6 prevents that. King comes to d4, king c6, forced to stop the king from coming to the c5 square. Knight to e1, looking to bring this knight to d3 to attack the b4 weakness. So king to b5 is played, and perhaps prematurely here. King b5, the idea of holding down this b4 square, is a slight mistake from black. The point is we got to bring this knight back into the game, and king b4 is not necessary until white plays that move, knight to e3. Once he plays knight e3, then the king's going to have to come to b5 to defend. But before he does, the knight is flexible. He might go to f3, or he might come to g2 if the pawn pushes. And so by playing this move prematurely, I thought in my mind it was a prophylactic move, but the truth is it's just sort of wasting a move because the king may not want to be stuck way over here on the queen side if all of the action ends up on the king side of the board, which is what we see occur. So g4 gaining space over there, knight starts to come back, b3 preventing my knight from coming into the position, and knight to c8. The point now is to reroute the knight all the way around to c6 in order to give check to this king and try to push white back a little bit. Knight f3, knight to e7, and in this position I actually offered my opponent a draw, and the computer evaluation here is completely equal. It's very hard for white to achieve a breakthrough. However, white is still slightly better. It's still difficult for black practically to defend this endgame, and the reason being is that these pawns here, though they look a little bit weak, it's hard to actually get the knight onto this d4 square. The king's going to prevent the knight from getting there, and if the knights trade off the board, white always has the possibility of playing this c3 move, trading off pawns, and creating this outside passed pawn, which can be used to deflect black away from the position. Now, this may be okay if black is able to keep this protected passer on d5. However, white has some breakthrough ideas over here once he gains more space on the king side, and this is what is really going to make the difference. There have to be two weaknesses really to break through in an ending. One of them is going to be my pawn on b4 and the potential for white to have an outside pass pawn. And the second weakness is going to be a potential kingside breakthrough. Let's see how white is able to start to create this and take advantage of it. h4 is played, knight c6 check, king to c5, king to e3, then king to c5. h5, and white of course has gotten all the space over here, And now black is going to have to figure out what to do in the position. There aren't a lot of moves left. There's no real great pawn moves for black. I mean, you can't really play d4 because then the king just comes up to e4. And what are you going to do? You're out of moves with your king and your knight, or else this pawn is falling. All you can do is push pawns over here, and really any pawn moves start to give white some breakthrough ideas. So really the only move for black here is to go ahead and play knight to e7, and this is not what happened in the game, but the reason why I did not play knight e7 was I was simply looking at after knight to d4. I could not see how to really hold anything as black. If we make another retreating move with the knight just killing time, white's going to start being able to press further with his pawns. And after a move like knight to c6, the problem is this king and pawn endgame is going to be losing for black, and it looks like it should be equal. But the point is, white has some very nice ideas. After king to d4, black has to stop white from ever playing king to c5. All he can do is shuffle between these squares c6, b6, and b5. But the problem is white gets some ideas as well. So as black is just killing time shuffling, white can play g5. Black can never take this, because if he does, the result will be an outside pass pawn that will queen for white, so black cannot take, he can only shuffle. And now white can create this second outside passer. So after something like takes and takes, the point is that there's going to be a second breakthrough idea. It looks like c5 is holding everything okay, but we get this move b4, king to c6, and now white has a second idea to break through, and that's going to be the move f5. And f5 looks crazy. All of these pawns are both hanging here. I can capture either way, but no matter which way you go, white is going to be able to create a passed pawn. So for example, if h takes on g5, then what we're going to do is play the move f6, attacking the g7 pawn. So if I recapture or push, then the h pawn will run up the board and queen. That would be no good, and white is faster here. If I play the move e takes f5, well, now it's going to be the e pawn which will make its way up the board and into the game. So the move e6 can come here now, and our f pawn is under attack. So if our f pawn goes ahead and takes here, well, I'm sorry, this is just fine because this is blocked up. So it's not the e pawn which is going to push, but it's the e pawn which will become passed after the move g6. So g6, and now the f pawn has to either move or capture, in which case this e pawn can run. And it looks like, okay, maybe black can be okay because this king can come back over here and go ahead and win the day. But in this line, the problem, well, I've made a slight mistake here for white, but in this line, one of the things that you have to look out for, if we go back a couple moves, is the potential that if this king is still on d4, we can take on d5. So we have to kill a couple more moves with white in order to show this and demonstrate this. So takes, king here, and now white can simply, I believe there's a way to kill a move for white. But this might be okay for black. It's hard to exactly tell where things fall in this situation, but white has all the breakthrough ideas, so maybe we can defend here. No, it's not going to work, because after the king check, and we see the move king to b5, in this case, what we're looking at for white is going to be that break like we showed, and after the pawn takes, g6, pawn takes f6, e6, and after king c6, it looks like we're going to come back and defend, right? But b5 check, and we can't stop both of these pawns after d6 b6, and one or the other will queen. If you take this, you can't get back in time. So white is winning here, sacking all the pawns to achieve the breakthrough. Crazy position, and this was all stuff that I had looked at in the game. Very difficult, very deep analysis, and because of that, I avoided knight to e7, and I played a move that actually loses on the spot. I played the move f6, and how does white achieve the winning breakthrough in this position? Well, first, e takes f6, g takes f6, and g5. And the point is that now this pawn is going to become passed. F takes g5, f takes g5, h takes g5, and off to the races goes the h pawn. The knight rushes back to stop it, but after the knight gets to g6, white can take our g pawn. His knight is coming to f7, and the game will end very quickly. King to e7, and promotes, and white is able to win the game. So a very nice game from Todd Charles Bryant, and a very instructive end game in the end. The only way for white, or black rather, to hold here at the end would have been that knight e7 move, which I disregarded, but the point is, after the knight comes to d4, rather than playing knight to c6, black should look at the move g6. And g6 will help to solidify everything on the king side here. It's black's last try to get through. g5 is still a potential break in the position, but it's a little bit harder here for white to achieve the breakthrough. This was black's best try at defending. Whether or not it would be able to work is still questionable, because g5 does create some real serious threats. Black does at least get this f5 square to help out in the battle. So there's things like h takes g5, g takes h6, and this guy is coming off to the races. So the knight's going to have to come to g6, and we get this sort of protected pawn battle going on here. White's going to try to work with this h-pawn. Black's going to try to work with his h-pawn. Very nice game in the end from Todd. And a tough loss, but hey, we took on the master and we held our ground pretty firmly. Didn't quite pull it off, and you know what? That's okay. Round 2, got to face another strong player, and this is Stuart Taylor Jr., and this time I had the white pieces. We had a perk defense, which transitioned into a queenless middle game very early. Queen's off the board on move 4. Actually, an early middle game endgame, which I used to play all the time as black, so I was very happy with this position. And with the last couple moves, white has played b3, creating a little bit of space for the knight, creating some options over there, and black has just played the move rook to d8, and now it's white to move, and we're going to see how I managed to muck up another game here. And a very nice move that comes from the black pieces in order to win this game. So in this position, you see that there's a lot of tension going on between these bishops on this diagonal. And white has a knight on d1. That's not so great. What I want to do is I want to reroute my knight. I want to play knight b2 and knight c4. Maybe force a trade of the bishops, bring my knight to a better square, centralize my rooks, and help to contest the e-file. Black also has some negatives. The queen's traded off earlier in the game on the d8 square. That's important to note. So black does not have the ability to castle, because black earlier played king takes d8 and king back to e8. So in order to get his rooks into the game, he's going to have to play king e7 at some point. So even though white has this knight on d1, which is stopping his rooks from helping out, black has this king on e8, which is stopping his rooks from getting connected and effective on the e-file as well. So there's a little bit of a dance going on here with who is going to more effectively manage to coordinate their pieces. Well, I continued with my idea. I played knight to b2, and this is a mistake. There should have been one move that I played first before going for something like this. And why is this a mistake? Well, the point is that not only do these bishops eye each other, but my bishop is actually pinned to my king as well, and black has a very nice way to take advantage of that. If you want to see if you can find it for yourself, pause the video, look for the move here that puts all the pressure on white and gives black a nice advantage from a position where white was really doing very well before. Rook to d2, and this puts this rook on the dominant file, and oh no, we cannot take it because bishop is pinned to the king. Totally overlooked this idea. A great maneuver from my opponent, and one which really frustrated me because I was quite happy with all of my position at this point. And I chose to go ahead and offer up a pawn essentially in this position in order to try to unravel a bit. Black still doesn't have his other rook able to come over to help, and because of that, I'm able to keep my bishop on the board. So I play bishop takes, rook takes, and then bishop back to a3, or e3 rather, holding this f4 square and this d4 square because this knight would love to come in and target my pinned knight, and basically giving back the piece was how I went about it. The problem is that after a move like bishop takes a7, which is what I was looking at, I was very afraid of the move knight to f4, and you'll see now that this knight is pinned and lost. This knight is hanging in emprise as well, and so I'm worried about the rook just taking with check, then taking my other knight. White would have to play a move like knight c4, and after rook takes knight, now the king is going to have to come to g1 or f1, entombing my own rook, and even this g-pawn is falling here as well. So the computer actually says this was white's best try. Personally, I don't like this position at all. I'm not very happy with playing it, but I do see that there's also ideas like knight takes e5, maybe knight coming in here with check. This king is also still not able to let the rook into the game, so white has some counterplay ideas here, but a very ugly position to have to deal with as the white pieces. I decided to play bishop back to e3 instead, securing everything and choosing to go into this endgame down a pawn, but with the bishop still on the board, so the bishop would be a nice defensive piece. Rook takes b2, rook h takes to b1, and the point is you can dance your rook around c1, b1, and a2 as long as you want, but I'm going to either force a trade-off or make a repetition if you do that. So rook takes b1 is pretty well forced, because if rook to c2, I just play rook to c1, and we can dance around here all day. That's fine with me to achieve a draw now that I'm down a pawn. So takes, and king e7, bringing the rook into the game. We're going to go ahead and fast forward several moves here. This is a very tough defensive game. White's trying everything they can in order to hold the balance, but we're going to see a very nice ending position here a little bit later on. So let's go ahead, fast forward in the position to over here. We get a move bishop c5, make a couple more moves, and this is the ending position that I would like to share with you guys. So, white is still down a pawn, but black is now relegated. This knight is on the edge of the board. White's bishop is doing a good job of defending and trying to secure all of black's weaknesses. White has a slightly more active king, and this is giving white some nice defensive possibilities here. Black plays the move knight to d6 check in order to bring this knight out into the game, the only way for black to make any progress whatsoever. And now comes a serious question in this game. This is a nice puzzle position. So if you have a minute, pause your video, and the question here is, if it's white to move, do you keep the bishop and the knight on the board with a move like king to f4? Or can you play the move bishop takes d6? If you play bishop takes d6, is the king and pawn ending a draw, a win, or a loss for the white pieces? This is what the key to evaluating this is going to be. So evaluate the move bishop takes d6, pause your video, look into that, and see if you can come up with the answer. First of all, if white plays the move king to f4, this is not a bad defensive try at all. It's true that black could play maybe king to c5. He can move his knight around to try to shore things up, so a move like knight f7 makes a lot of sense, building this sort of wall to keep the king from coming in, and trying to make sure white doesn't penetrate, but it's very difficult for black to make forward progress in this position. White's going to use his bishop to secure his pawns. Even though they're on the same color as his bishop, this makes it so white doesn't really have a lot to attack in black's position, but it gives him better chances to hold his weaknesses as well. So this would be one way to play. White can pretty well dance back to d4, try to keep black's king out, and it's going to be this battle of one another sort of eyeing these squares, trying to keep each other's kings out. And we're going to have a lot of moves left in the game as black dances around and white dances around, and each side tries to go about their business. If we play bishop takes d6, this is a definite move. We go into a king and pawn endgame, and king and pawn endgames are always going to be one thing or another. They are clear-cut. They need to be calculated precisely because they have very forced sequences of moves. So after king takes d6, and this is what happened in the game, what I had calculated and what I had looked at was this line, and let's go ahead and count it because I want you to get an idea for how to calculate these endgames and what to look at. So I calculated the race. f5, g5, king takes h5, king takes g4, h5, h6, h7, h8 equals queen. This was going to take me a total of 8 moves in order to queen. Black has a couple ways to go about business here. One would be to play king d5, king c4, king takes b4, b5, b4, b3, b2, c1. Also 8 moves to queen, but white goes first. So white will queen on h8, then black will queen on c1, and then white can play a move like queen to e5, which will defend the a5 pawn, defend the g3 pawn, and be roughly equal. It's going to be difficult to convert this ending, but white certainly isn't any worse. Not winning perhaps, but we're going to have a draw, and maybe white can even try to press with a passed g-pawn. However, black has another way to do this. So we already know that white's play is going to take 8 moves in order to queen on h8. Black's other try would be to play the move c5. And after c5, we have b takes c5, king takes c5. This I still all count as one move because white has to make the recapture. So this is essentially 1. Then we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So once again, 8 moves for black in order to push his b-pawn up the board, capture white's pawns. White also takes 8 moves to queen. He queens first on b8, and then it becomes a6 pawn versus g3 pawn. This should be a draw in this position. We can just start checking around with the king and the queen, and nothing is ever going to happen more than a draw. However, black had one more try, and this was the try that I missed. Very nice calculation from black. I went into this line, I had looked at both of those and saw white should be good, but there's one thing I overlooked, and let's see what that is. So king f5, c5, b takes c5, king takes c5. We've looked at all this. King to g5, and now, and I realized it after king to g5 before I made this move, but what I had overlooked, b6. b5 also accomplishes the same idea, and the point is that once I take this pawn on b6 and the king takes, now this passed a pawn is actually one move faster than it was in the previous line, and the reason is that the king is not having to capture a pawn in front and then move out of the way. So black does not have to lose a tempo to move his king from in front of the pawn, and he's gained a move in this line as a result. I completely overlooked this when I played the move bishop takes knight, and the reason being, if we go back a few moves, was that, well, with this king on d6, you would never dream of playing b6 because a takes b5 just creates a passed pawn, and it's going to be too much trouble for you to have to defend it. But after the king comes to c5, now this is a real possibility. I completely forgot that once the king comes to c5, he can, of course, push this b-pawn because king takes b6 is in the position. And you may say, well, okay, right? When we looked at those other lines, even if black gains a tempo, black will queen and then white will queen next, right? Before white was queening first, so now white just queens second. What is so tricky about this line? The problem is that it's the A pawn and the H pawn, and even though white will queen one move after, it is black who queens, and holds the queening square. Oh my gosh, a beautiful endgame puzzle. This is the sort of thing you see in those tactics trainers, and you're looking at endings. Unfortunately, it is me on the wrong side of this puzzle. A gorgeous finish in the actual game rather than entering this line after a4. I played king f5, tried to be a little bit cheeky, see if I could keep these pawns on the board, but of course it's still completely winning for black. Queen to g7, a very nice move. If I push either pawn, you simply step the queen in front and create a blockade. So if, for example, I play h6 here, then you can play queen to h7, because the point is if g6, then you can just take the other pawn. And if I play g6, which is what I do, then after queen to h6 and king f6, even though it looks like my pawn's getting very close, black can hold in a couple of ways. He could go for the whole checking thing, and when my king gets in front, move his king closer, which works against the g-pawn just fine. But black plays queen e8 even easier, simply keeping my king from coming up, and he can plop his own queen onto the g8 square, where I will never be able to make forward progress. So I resigned in this position, and Stuart Taylor pulled off a very nice win from the endgame, even though it was a very long and hard-fought battle. Unfortunately, once again, just that small miscalculation, very close to being able to hold the draw against a higher-rated opponent. I needed to find that move back in here, rather than capturing. King to f4 would hold the draw, even though it would still be a long and hard battle from this point. So make sure you're really calculating with those king and pawn endgames. They can be so crazy and so much to look at, but that is where you will win or lose some of these games. One more to go, and this is the third round game against Joshua Harrison, another 2100 rated opponent. And this game came out of another French defense, which I played on the black side. Let's talk a little bit about what is happening in this position. So in this variation of the French, white has gambited their d4 pawn. You'll notice black has this extra pawn that's sitting here on d4. White's idea is simply to try to create this firm outpost on e5. He wants to defend this square, and then he's going to reroute his other knight over to b3, recapture on d4, and try to get his pieces developed in a harmonious manner that will take some space away from black. The problem, of course, is that black is a little bit quicker right now. So black's last move, queen to c7, is challenging this e5 outpost. It's only defended twice, the rook and the knight. And black is attacking it 3 times, both knights and the queen, and saying, hey, you know what? I already got one pawn, but I want to take your other one. I want control of the whole center if I can grab it. And typically in the French, if black can get rid of both of these pawns and trade them off, black is going to achieve a very nice game, going to be able to have some very nice central control. So this is something white wants to avoid. 2 options for white here. One is to play the move bishop takes g6. And bishop takes g6 would, of course, remove an attacker of the e5 square. But it's a move that a lot of French players or people playing against French for white don't really want to do. And the reason is this d3 bishop is considered a very strong attacking piece against the black king side. And giving it up for the knight, not only are you giving up this bishop, but also, after I play h takes, I get a nice h-file for my rook. My pieces look like they're coming into the game pretty well. And black can continue with ideas like f6 in the future, trying to force a trade on the square where the bishop can come to d6. A lot of pressure can go against h2. And black's actually thinking of potentially stepping his king up to f7. So, for example, if white plays knight to b3, looking to win back the pawn, black can play f6. And after a move like knight takes d4, well, black could consider capturing on this e5 square because he does have 3 attackers. So white really has to decide, am I going to give up the center to allow this? Maybe not the best. White ends up doubling black's g-pawn, but black can always castle queenside here, and black has a beautiful center. Little bit awkward looking for the white pieces. Black could also simply play a move like king to f7 and maintain the solidity of the position. This is still a threat. He's going to develop his bishop next, double rooks on the h-file. There's so many ideas for black in this position, and it's very solid, nice central control, easy to play. It's hard to figure out how to keep pressing with the white pieces, so my opponent did not play the move bishop takes g6, even though objectively there's nothing wrong with it, but my opponent played queen to e2, and this gives black a very nice possibility to take over the game. So in the next couple moves, I finally get my shot here in the Southern Open in order to try to take over a little bit, and let's see how I do that. So the point here is that after queen to e2, yes, you have 3 defenders on e5. However, you have not played knight b3 yet, and this knight on d2 is blocking your bishop from being able to help effectively in any sort of way, and so black can afford to play knight f4, hitting the queen on the e2 square, saying, where are you going to go? And also putting pressure on the d3 bishop, and saying, I'm going to take this bishop if I want to now. Even though you didn't take on g6, I'm still going to go ahead and take it if I want it. Queen came to f1, and there's a couple different ways for black to play this position. One would be to capture the bishop, would be solid, but it lets white simply develop the queen to a better square and continue with his plans after knight b3. The other option would be that f6 idea, which we already looked at. f6, putting the question once again to e5 by attacking it 3 times, and white has to choose whether to take it, where black now gets a very strong pawn center. Maybe he'll castle kingside, maybe he'll bring the king to f7. Even though these pawns around the king look a little airy, there's not a good immediate way for white to take advantage of this, and black has a very strong center, so this is a nice looking game for the black pieces. I decided to take another approach in this game and go creative. I wanted to go for the gusto. 2 losses in the first 2 rounds, right? I wanted to find a really fun, exciting way. f6 objectively may be slightly better than the move I played, but I played a move which is honestly just exciting to play over the board, and one which I cannot help, but if I see it and it's going to give me a nice position, it's very hard to avoid because this is just too much fun. g5. g5, putting this pawn where it can be attacked by the knight. It looks like it's just hanging, just creating some space on my king side. And the point is, hey, usually white attacks on this side over here. Now black is going to launch an attack. Black is coming after your king instead. And what is the real reason behind this move? Well, of course, if you play knight takes g5 right away, then you are losing a defender of the e5 square, and I can play knight takes e5, piling up on this bishop before deciding whether or not to capture, and creating some nice open lines for my queen. My rook can come to g8 potentially, and I'm going to get some very big attacking ideas very fast. White definitely does not want to play in this way at all. This would give black all the fun in the position. Looks quite lovely. So rather than taking the pawn, white has to choose to do something else, and white continues with his idea, knight to b3, right? He's going to go ahead, aim to recapture on the c4 square, and open up the bishop to come back into the game. The other idea behind the g5 move is that, well, it helps to secure this knight on f4, so after white has played knight b3, bishop takes f4, the knight's not hanging. I could leave this knight on the f4 square if I choose to. However, with black, my idea was not to leave the knight on the f4 square. That would be one way of playing. You could try something like bishop g7 perhaps, trying to aim for the e5 square that way. That's one line. However, what I really wanted to do was keep pressing up the board, keep gaining space, and we saw the move knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and g4. And the point here is that now your knight is really put to the question. If it comes to the edge of the board, if we play a move like knight to h4, this knight is going to end up stuck over here on the edge. Black can play bishop e7, and where is this knight going? All of its squares are taken up. You have to play a move like either queen g3 or g3, neither of which look very nice. After g3, we can even take this knight and just ruin white's structure. We'll have a nice kingside attack going very shortly. Knight takes e5, attacks the queen, wins another piece, threatens the f3 square. Everything's falling apart here, so we don't want to bring the knight to h4. And knight to g5 runs into the same problem. Once again, where is this knight going? All of his squares are covered up, and we can attack the knight a number of ways, h6 or bishop to e7. We can even consider just playing another move here, maybe playing something along the lines of bishop to g7 and piling on the e5 square. This knight is so stuck, it's going to be hanging out a piece blowing in the wind ready to be attacked. So white, instead of that, plays the more straightforward move, knight f takes d4. And yes, this gets the pawn back from the d file, but the knight is no longer on f3. The e5 pawn is no longer protected, and we can play knight takes e5. So black has accomplished what he's wanted. He's gained control of the center now. White's central pawns are gone. Black is up a pawn, and of course, creating a little bit of attack as well against the queen. Queen steps back to e2, bishop to d6, and my opponent played a move which I got to give him a lot of credit for here. I definitely underestimated this move in the game, and that's bishop to g5. Bishop g5, the whole idea is to keep my king from being able to castle, lock it into the center of the board, making it a little more difficult for me. Of course, this allows me to play rook g8 with a tempo, which looks like this is just going to help out black's attack, right? I'm simply moving my rook to the better position, getting ready to start maybe pushing pawns up the board at you. And after bishop h4, well, white is still keeping me in the center of the board, and these dark squares are a little airy around the king. I'm always going to have to be careful with this. Black is still better. Black still has a very nice position. But unfortunately, this is the part of the game where I got too greedy, I got too anxious, I looked for ways to open up lines, I looked for ways to try to break on through and punch to that immediate victory, and a small miscalculation throws away a very nice game. This is a winning game here for black. Really, the ideas you want to be looking at, we want to look at things like doubling on the g file if we can ever castle. One way to do that would be to play a move like knight to g6, where if the bishop comes back to g3, now we'll be able to castle on the queen side, or maybe we even take first, one way or the other. That would be one way to go about business. We could try to expand with moves like h5 first, where now this knight g6 is going to be even stronger. This would be another way to continue the attack. So lots of different ideas in this position for black. Black needs to play slowly and keep building the pressure. Instead, I dove for the gusto and played the move knight f3, and this is another one of those moves that's just so enticing. When you see a sacrifice like this, and you see that it's still going to lead to a better position, because this doesn't lose by any means for black, it still leads to a better position for black. It's hard to avoid some of these sacrifices sometimes because they're just too fun. You just say, man, I really want to go for it. Only move here which does not lose is knight takes f3. You can't take with the pawn, of course, because then g takes f3 wins the queen with check against the king. So we can't do that. Knight takes f3, g takes f3, and now queen takes f3. And white has gotten the pawn back, but black has opened up these lines. The pawns and everything are now pointed at the white king. Bishop takes h2, king to h1, and now the bishop drops back to e5. And this is slightly maybe inaccurate. The bishop might be better on the f4 square, but the point behind bishop e5 was a concrete idea which was miscalculated, and let's go ahead and see how that affects us. White plays the move c3, and here I was just waiting to see this move from white. I had looked at this, and I felt that there was going to be an immediate knockout punch-down blow, put a cork in it, win it for black, and oh my goodness, was I wrong on that. I totally missed one move, which unfortunately unravels all of black's game, this hard work that black has put in. In this position, what black should do, and this was the other idea that I had. There's two ideas. There's one which is my knockdown punch-out blow, which we'll look at in a minute and see how it fails. And the other is simply black can continue to play slow. Once again, we know black wants to castle queenside, but this bishop is a pain in our side. We want to play f6, but it's defended twice. So how do we go about doing all this? Simply rook to g6. Rook to g6 keeps a nice advantage for black. Black is going to play f6 next, securing the bishop, defending the square twice. Then he can castle to the queen side, double rooks on the g-file, and start looking at ways to continue to pressure the white king side. This is still a winning advantage for black, a very nice way to play the game, and one that I am most upset to not have gone for. What did I do instead? Well, I went for this exciting move, d4, and this is a question mark move, of course, with a very fun idea behind it that simply does not work. And the point is, after d4, we see knight takes d4. And after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, c takes d4, and the whole idea behind this, even though I've gotten rid of another attacker, very double-edged, right? This dark square bishop is defending these dark squares that white would love to take control of. The whole point is to play bishop to c6, opening up the file for the bishop, getting that long diagonal, and look at this rook and this bishop taking aim on g2. This looks great, white, right? White is going to be completely lost. Black is crushing through the position. Wrong. White has a very nice tactic here, and unfortunately it is game over for black. I totally overlooked this idea, and credit to my opponent for finding it. Very frustrating result for me. See if you can find the winning move for white. All other moves lose. Only one move that saves the game for the white pieces here. Pause your video, take a look, see if you can find the save for white. And that's going to be d5. And this was what I overlooked. The whole point behind d5 is that the rook is pinning the pawn on the e6 square, and black cannot take with the pawn. So after bishop takes e5, simply queen takes d5 and loses the piece and the game. So we cannot take the pawn. And if we cannot take the pawn, then the world is falling apart, because if we have to move this bishop, for example, bishop d7, well, now white can either take the pawn, which is going to help to destroy our center, or simply play queen f6, which is what happened in the game. Here I played one more move, more out of spite. Black can resign at this point. Of course, the queen e7 is a threat. You have to deal with that. I played the move queen d8, kind of just offering up this idea of, okay, if you really want to win the exchange, I'll let you do that right away, and maybe I can try to defend this endgame down in exchange. It should still be losing, but whatever, at least I can fight a few more moves. Of course, black doesn't have to accept, or white doesn't have to accept this, and white can play the finishing blow, d takes e6. And the point is, if you take the queen, the bishop falls with check before white recaptures. And if you take the pawn, simply rook takes e6 will win the game after takes, and queen takes with check, opening up the bishop onto the queen. This is game over. So GG after d takes e6. I went ahead and played one more move. I played the move bishop to c6, saying, all right, let's go back to my old idea. Hail Mary, full of grace, throw the rook at the g2 pawn. But of course, what can white do here? Look for the mate in one at this point, which black is hanging. Queen takes f7, checkmate. And oh my goodness, how things fell apart for black. Just 4 moves ago, we were completely winning. If we go back to this position, black is in a very nice spot. As we said, all we got to do, rook g6, f6, castles queenside, and what a beautiful game for black to have. Very nice opening play, but unfortunately, the knockout blow was not there in this one. We tried too much to push forward, and you know what? A very rough tournament, 0 points out of 3 in this. More likely than not, I will be falling back below my expert rating, back below 2,000 for the first time in almost 8 years. However, we played some very strong opponents, 2,200 to 2,100s, and you know what? I held my own well. I've got to hold my head high at the end of the day. 0 out of 3 points. This could very easily have been 2 out of 3 points. We had draws positions in the first one and the second one, and a completely won game in the third that we just managed to throw away. But definitely feel that the caliber of my play is just that little bit off, right? Just that little bit of push, that little bit extra calculation, and I'll be hanging with the big boys before too long here. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Definitely look at some of the end games from it, some of the fun, exciting positions. I hope that you're able to take a little bit away from that. Make sure you're working on your calculations so you don't fall into the pitfalls I do, and before long, you'll be beating up not only on me, but on all of these other guys as well. Can't wait to see what you all do in your games ahead. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, post any comments, and share via the buttons below. Check out our website at chesswithnick.com for further video, more content, and any postings on lessons, further video analysis, or written analysis that you may be interested in. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Chess with Nick, on youtube.com. Have a great day, and wishing you best of luck.